Thank you for calling Capsim. This is Austin.
Hey, Austin, it's Professor Tips here. I have an afternoon session today with one of my capstone courses, and I need some help with the report. They just finished the second round, and I want to talk through the results live with them in class today. But when I did it for round one, I mostly kept to the top page. I read off the sales, the profits, who was in the lead, but I didn't feel like I was able to explain why. So I'm hoping there's some information that you can pull me in, some points that I can pull out that I can be sharing with my students.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd be happy to help. You say this class was today?
Yeah, in an hour.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, I got it. Let me go ahead and pull up your account and we'll dive into it.
Awesome.
Well, I've got your report pulled up here. And the nice thing is, I know we're going to be covering kind of some main talking points today, and those talking points are actually going to be usable in any one of your industries. So, I mean, I think it's totally fine that you focus on the first page. There's actually some good info to talk about here. Really, when I'm going through a debrief, I think there's a couple main things that I focus on. The first and kind of biggest elephant in the room, I would say, is did a team receive an emergency loan or not? That's the first thing that I'm looking for. And coincidentally enough, looks like Team Ferris did catch an emergency loan. So we'll definitely talk about kind of why that emergency loan happened as we get down the report. But in general, emergency loans will happen for one of two reasons, right? Maybe there could just be a simple lack of financing that happened, or more often than not, it's actually due to overproduction or having too much excess inventory by the end of the year. So we'll be able to find out where that came from as we go a little bit further down the report. But that's the first thing that I'm looking for. If teams are hitting emergency loans, this is something that we want to avoid going forward. So really, really important that we cover that with the class. I think this would be a good use case for everybody to learn from, frankly. So first place that we would go when we see that there's emergency that happened, first place that I'm looking at is assuming that it might be an inventory issue. I'm scrolling down to page 4 to look at where all of our products sold and how much inventory we have left over. Right. So we get down to page 4. We can see all the products here. And just as we assumed when we look at Team Ferris here that had the emergency loan, we have a lot of excess inventory here. And ultimately, this would be what I would bring up with this team is that, hey, essentially it looks like they expected to sell more than they otherwise should have. And they basically produced more than they needed. And not only did they not sell those units, but ultimately we're having to pay excessive inventory carrying costs, essentially just to house that inventory in our warehouse. Now we're talking about how obviously inventory or having high levels of inventory is the issue for our Team Ferris here, and that was really where their emergency loan came from. We also see on this page that I think, another point that I would definitely touch on, or I think that would be really helpful for other teams, is to talk about these stockouts. Right? It looks like every other team had at least one product, and even Team Erie had all of their products stock out. So these are definitely points that I would bring up with the class when we're debriefing, because a lot of these issues, whether we underproduced or stocked out or overproduced, most of those things have to deal with forecasting, right? Forecasting is really the first step into how we produce. So usually that breakdown happens with our forecasts. So I think a good area after we've evaluated this page, we can look at inventory levels. I think a really good area to reference after this page would be to look at our market share report. That market share report, which is on page 10, is ultimately going to break down our actual market share in units, or the amount of sales that we actually realized, versus our potential. Here's our page here. We've got our actual market share on the left versus our potential on the right. So let's take a look at Team Ferris here. We're going to go down that same line. This is the team with our emergency loan. Now, it's kind of interesting, actually, with Team Ferris. Team Ferris actually sold more than they should have. Based on their potential, they only should have capitalized on roughly 12%, 11.9% of the market, and they actually capitalized on 14.5%. Even though this happened, they sold more than they should have, they still overproduced. So this was clearly a breakdown in terms of forecasting. We had over forecasted our sales. So I think this would be a good time to maybe ask this team in particular, what was their thought process, or how did they come to the forecast that they gathered? We could even go even further and maybe even ask the class. Right. I think it's really, really a good point that we can get the students engaged with this conversation, is to touch on this actual versus potential situation that occurred.
So I should
Um,
ask Ferris about their forecasts and what they expected to happen?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a really, really good talking point. I mean, asking them how did we build these forecasts? What was the justification there? Were there updates that we were making that we thought that we were going to have better results? Were we seeing things in the market, right? And allow them to kind of explain how they came to those forecasts. I think that's a really, really good point. Now, on the reverse side of things, we also have Team Erie here, which is an interesting team as well. It looks like they're kind of on the opposite end of that spectrum to where they actually sold less than what they should have sold. Now, this is a situation we want to avoid too, right? Essentially, there were situations where, we could look at one of their products, product E here. They sold less than what they should have. They actually sold 17.3% of the traditional market, where they should have sold 18.2%. Now, one thing that I would bring up, and I think that one way to kind of get the class engaged as well, is to explain that, hey, product E missed out on their market share. And when we look at the next team up, looks like team or product Days, which was a traditional product, actually sold more than they should have. It's probable that Days, some of their extra demand that they were able to gather came from the stock out from product E. So we could maybe engage with the class a little bit more and tell them, hey, Days just ate some of your market share, Erie. We want to make sure that we increase that production to make sure that we avoid that happening again. We don't want to give those sales away to Team Digby.
Echo
So
too. They look like
yeah,
they lost a lot there.
right. Same situation, right? Where we've got our product Echo. We were supposed to capitalize it. We missed out on almost 7% of the market here. So ultimately, that market share was split up across all of these other products where we see Days had more sales than they should have. Cake had a little bit more than they should have, right?
They
So
handed
this
the
is
money over to their competitors.
right. They just handed it away, right? These are situations that we want to make sure that we avoid. So ultimately, I think that arguably overproduction is definitely a bigger evil, right? This is a situation that might lead to an emergency loan, but we also don't want to be underproducing or just stocking out and missing out on our organic demand that we should be gathering. Right? It's a really, really important section. And I think a lot of these points can be extrapolated for all of the teams because, frankly, all of the teams had breakdowns in actual versus potential, which again could be driven back to their forecasting. So we've talked about this market share section. I think this is a really, really important section to cover. This is definitely one that is going to be, I'm looking at every time I'm debriefing. So I think there's a lot that we can talk about just in this section alone.
Cool.
Now, the other thing that I think we talked pretty good detail about, emergency loans, forecasting, right? These are going to be problem areas. The other area that I like to focus debriefing around is teams' contribution margins. So when we come back up to the top page here, we're going to get a breakdown of our team's collective margins. So this is basically the average margin that they have across all of their product offerings. And really the threshold that we want to see teams achieving is a margin of at least 30% or more. So I guess some standouts on this page, the one that I think we should probably focus on with our debrief, or what I would focus on in the debrief, is Team Erie here. Team Erie is below that 30% threshold. So I would focus on, what's going on here. Let's try to engage with the class and find out what we could do to increase this margin. How I would go about doing that, since this is more of a collective margin, I think is important is if we get the breakdown of each of our individual products. So again, we're going to scroll back down to page 4. As you're already probably imagining, page 4 is also a really, really important section when we're trying to debrief the class. There's a lot of information going on in here. So when we were looking at Team Erie, they were the ones that were struggling in terms of margins. I want to pick out the products that are really hurting. And one that comes off the page here is Echo. Echo is sitting at a 14% margin, which is pretty abysmal, right? We want to make sure that we're growing that. So the nice thing is here, we get kind of a breakdown of Echo's stats from left to right. Their margin is made up of what they're pricing one unit at versus what it's costing them to make it. Now, in terms of debriefing, what I would ultimately want to do with this team is go and try to compare Echo to its competitors, because that's what students should be doing anyway. We should be looking at, well, what are our competitors doing that we're not? Right. So one way we could do that, since we know that Echo is a traditional product, let's take a look at the traditional segment and see what we might not be doing or what our competitors are doing better than us. So we come down to this traditional segment here. That's the next page down. And we can find our product Echo here. Right now, first thing that we could evaluate when we're looking at margins is the price point that we have Echo at. And as of right now, we're at a pretty competitive price point, right? There's a couple products that we're right in kind of the mix here. So I think arguably our price is okay. But the one thing that does kind of stand out right next to it is our MTBF level. It's way higher than our competitors, which ultimately MTBF, or our reliability, is what drives our material costs. And this is really increasing our costs significantly, right? Ultimately, we could evaluate, or maybe this would be a good talking point to bring up with the class to engage them. Hey, does anybody have an idea of what might be the breakdown of their low margin here with Product Echo, right? We might not just give them this flat out. Hopefully, if anybody's paying attention to the report here, we'll notice this outlier, right? I think that's a really good way to engage with the class, have them kind of steer the conversation from there. We can kind of bring this up and go, well, what could Echo do better, right? Like, where would you guys start? I think that's a really good way to get them engaged.
Yeah, it looks like
Um,
the customers like it. It's stocked out, but it's not
right.
sustainable for the company, huh?
Right, exactly. So I think this would be a very simple way to kind of not only touch on the contribution margin aspect, but ultimately we're also looking at how we can be a little bit more competitive, right? So yeah,
Right.
definitely a good place to bring that up. So again, just kind of summarizing everything. I think those are the main points that I'm going to be talking about, right? I'm looking at, does the team have an emergency loan or not? Want to talk about the inventory breakdowns on page 4, right? We can see a lot of teams that either might have overproduced or had stockouts. We want to make sure that we're covering those. A lot of that information is going to be covered in our market share report all the way at the bottom, where we get a breakdown of our actual versus potential. Again, a place where we had a lot of talking points for any team, whether we had an emergency loan or not. This is kind of where I center the debrief for any industry, right? This could be copy and pasted in any scenario. So hopefully that helps.
Yeah, just to be sure, even if I don't have an emergency loan, I should still talk about inventory, actual versus potential contribution margin.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think I center the conversation around these topics because these are pitfalls that almost every team falls into at some point, right? So I think whether we have that emergency loan or not, we can still keep the conversation centered around, hey, how did we monitor inventory levels? How are we comparing our product to our competitors? Or what are we doing that they're not, or vice versa? Right. I think regardless if we have that emergency loan or not, these are still really great areas to kind of focus the conversation around to engage the class.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Austin. I think I've got some stuff to bring to class today and appreciate your time.
Absolutely, Professor Tips. Anything else comes up, don't hesitate to reach out, okay?
Take care.
All right, take care.